before we move on to the discussion of the film and reading of the rest of the protocol.
I just wanted to clarify.
Sure.
So like the notion of like labeling the past, like categorizing past as kind of positive or like negative way is like itself colonial.
Well, it's not so much like I want to just push the label of colonial and dismiss it or something like that. There's a certain way of, as Timothy Mitchell explains, constructive of identity, human subject in colonialism, in and through colonialism. So what happens in this kind of gesture of recuperating something from the past is the assumption that there is an identical relationship to the past. So like I am pre-colonial and then I'm colonized, and then when I'm post-colonial, I'm sort of the same kind of transforming identity, and I can recuperate my past and somehow renew it somehow. That notion of identity is really the kind of trick that we are always searching for something that as if it's lost. And that's also a kind of European gesture too. Like, you know, I mean, I kept saying identity crisis, but is it even possible to conceptualize any notion of identity without perpetual crisis? It's always crisis, it's in crisis. So we talked about this in a different way in Derrida, for example. Like, I'm always searching for something. There is something me. Who am I really? It's like, that kind of suggests the kind of archaic identity that is there in its, you know, sort of proper fashion or something like that. That's the problem. So sometimes you can just say, well, there's that very search and that's it. It's not even, but that mythology of creating that there is something lost. That's the sort of, I don't say colonial in the sense of a certain way of thinking that allows colonialism to function in the world today. So like it became such a label now, like colonial, it's almost like a, you know, meaningless. And that's really the important point in making that claim. If an analytic tool explains a lot, too much, everything, then you really don't have any kind of discriminatory understanding of what it means to be colonial. So that's kind of paradox also of explanation. If you explain everything, you don't really separate anything from anything else, then you don't explain anything. So that's why I want to resist the kind of grand gestures of colonialism, just to understand, or even ask the question how this takes place.
Like there's the notion of like searching for the it's does it connect to like notion to find like purity?
Yes.
Okay.
Purity, exactly. And that I mean, if you read colonial literature, the literature around the times of colonialism, there's always that Western subject going to the East in search of him or herself, mostly himself, but also herself too. So there's that kind of, this is where I'm come from, the East, the beginning, the origin of the humankind, and I'm searching my roots and somehow reconciling with my roots in creating a totalizing discourse about myself. Like I'm this kind of authentic self that has an essence. And that's really a very significant understanding in change in understanding of identity. So in a sense, you can say, and that's also undermines this kind of logic in colonialism. And I posed that question like that, so I want to somehow clarify that a little bit. So whatever you do, you are a bad copy of Europe. So there's that kind of notion in post-colonialism. You are either going to be just like Europe or going to be the opposite of Europe. Now, one way of dealing with this dilemma is to say that, well, actually, that very opposition might give us the impression that there's a European identity, that there is an authentic, solid European identity. No, that's precisely what colonialism builds upon the colonized as an idea. So we now to think that, like, I don't know whether this happens to you, but when I go home and people are interested in certain questions, I immediately start thinking, oh, well, this comes from the West. This is a Western concern, which is maybe discursively, historically a little bit accurate, but what it does is to trace the origin of a certain way of thinking to a certain geographical colonial origin and claim that, oh, they are entitled to do, I'm sort of a bad copy. And to undermine that understanding of identity as recuperating something original is also questioning that very distinction. Like, French is spoken in France. That's what properly belonged to them. They have that, the world order. How many of you think that the world order is controlled by the world? No, we believe world order is controlled by certain power groups and economic interests, etc. We already construct this notion of identity versus imitation. And that needs to be questioned, because that's what Europe does in appropriating certain things to them, like this is our identity, which means it's not your identity. And if you ask that question, and the Eastern countries like Turkey, for example, does that, oh, that's a Western concern. No, if it is an existential concern, it cannot be just a Western concern. And just because you might think historically they might have raised that question earlier, which is also questionable, doesn't mean that it's their question. And it is under their authority, under their tutelage. And that's important to notice, because that always puts us in this position of being not just as second-hand citizens, but as being kind of a copy of an original. And people doubt themselves, and post-colonial scholars have that issue too. Like, what I'm doing is simply a repetition. I'm never going to be just like a European scholar in terms of my access to language and certain questions and the history and education, etc. And then we sort of think like, oh, philosophy properly is done in philosophical centers, like, well, not Athens, but Cambridge and Oxford or wherever. So. Yeah, don't fall for that. But also don't fall for this kind of like my other authentic identity that is completely different than Europe and pure and wonderful. Okay, any questions? Yes, Claudia.
So referring to what you said about like scholars, and their like preoccupation of like, oh, I will never have like access or like mobility as like European scholars or like Western scholars. So does that come from the same, like, I feel like it comes from the same like problem of like coloniality of like, and like mobility and access. But then if this has set to be the way of you being heard or being published in this case as like a scholar, like I feel like that crisis is valid in a sense of like, even though you are starting like or reading about your own concerns, but like you will never be heard because of like how the system works. And I feel like that's kind of valid in like that preoccupation of like, yeah, I don't have access to like even being published or like being asserted, while other people might even like read what I write and like think that I'm valid in that sense. But still like not be published or like even be heard, and then like someone else comes and write the same thing just being white or Western and does. So like I don't know, like I just struggle with that. Like I feel like that crisis of like being wanted to be heard or like wanting to have access to the same um like spaces and kind of like it's kind of valid, but I don't know how to work that through the post-colonial process.
No, that's an excellent question. I think that's a very valid and incisive question. And you are right. There is a certain structure of, let's just formulate it in terms of publication, just because you said that, but it is probably valid with many other access of economic power globally, that it is controlled by certain identities, let's say. But when we talk about structures, one of the things that we make a mistake is that structure is something that is established and it is already there and it is working. It's kind of a stable entity. That's how we think of structures, like it's already established. What we miss, or what we don't always pay as much attention, is the idea of repetition that is necessary for providing the stability of structures. So every time that is, structure is always repeated. Without being repeated, it really doesn't have any kind of ontological existence. But of course, that repetition becomes much easier sometimes because you are set in your certain ways. But when you are born in a certain country, go to a certain school, there are already access, as you put it, that is established, but you repeat those structures of access because you look in a certain way, you come from a certain institution as opposed to others who don't. But the paradox of that is that you imagine that there is a sort of originality associated with that. But it is really not original, it is always repeated anew every single time. Now, the dilemma is that you are trying to be heard in a structure that is established by others. And that's sort of the access dilemma. Namely, when I say, I need the same kind of power and representation and voice as other people in this Western discourse has. Now, that's an economic question. That is a question of opportunity. That's a question of having access to, and it is a valid question and something that needs to be negotiated if it can. But it's not a question of not falling into this identity category of thinking, if I want to be heard, I need to speak in a certain way. Because that's precisely what it does, is like, it suggests that there is an identity propriety associated with this speech. So now you say, in order to be heard, I need to speak in a certain way, write in a certain way, articulate my ideas in a certain way. I need to be proper. And that's really what I'm trying to put into question, because those structures are repeated not because they are proper, but in their repetition, they produce what it means to be proper. That's an important distinction, because we tend to suggest that these long-standing structural sort of repetitions are proper. That's how you need to do. If you want to publish, Claudia, if you are interested in this, you have to write in this way. You have to have 135 footnotes, and therefore you have to be heard by other people who know this stuff, who are experts on this, who claim to have done this for years and have that kind of identity associated with that. That's really the problem, because once we represent ourselves in those structures, we are actually accepting the authority of those structures. And we are not speaking with our voice anymore. I mean, we don't even know whether we have a voice anymore. We just have to speak in a certain way. So the representation always has this paradox of, you can only be represented if you make yourself presentable. And if you are presentable, you are affirming an identity according to which you become presentable. And that's really the notion in terms of representation, but also economically. in the sense that we always think like, oh, in order to be able to be successful, you have to do this. We already established these rules, and sure, we can grant you access, not much, but at least representationally acceptable, and that's how we are going to proceed. That's what I'm trying to put into question. I'm not denying that there's an exclusion, but the question is, if I eradicate exclusion, am I really establishing a, I don't know, decolonial structure? And Hala is a very good example of this, actually. Yes, we are. Loudly, please. Thank you.
I think one question I have following on that is kind of about like the idea that you like you join the game so that you can make
Sure.
like yeah like you write things a certain way, you know that it's not the proper way, you still do it because you think that it's like moving one step back to move two step forwards to like spread some ideas that you feel like would change the system in a significant way. Is it, how do you measure that? Is it like, yeah, is it like, oh, I'm repeating something and I'm establishing that identity, but at the same time, the positive it creates is better than the negative? Is it just something you have to think about and make the best you can?
Well, then again, I mean, I want to be careful for myself to characterize this as a positive or a negative change, in the sense that you can both simultaneously accept, yes, I am actually participating in a system which initially continuously up to this point excluded me, but now I'm included. The question that I should ask myself is my identity is so strong or so unchanging that exclusion or inclusion doesn't really change anything in me? I'm the same person. I'm the same identity, which would be a question mark for me and for others. But also you really cannot anticipate, and maybe you should not try to master that anticipation, how your actions are going to play themselves out, because you really don't know whether you are changing the world positively or negatively. That really depends on other people's response too, and also how people see you, how they read your actions, whether you are a sellout or a radical, etc. So those are all very complex questions. So I cannot answer that categorically yes or no. It really depends on the specific circumstances, on what is going to happen, even in probably sometimes in the long run. So, and I'm not sort of giving you a sort of strategy about how to deal with so that you can become blameless and pure and always do the right thing. But even the question itself to me is interesting while you are doing something, because even that sensibility of raising that question might actually change certain structures, however small or large they might be. So I don't know. In other words, I don't know. It depends on what you are doing. But publishing articles in Western journals probably doesn't do much. I mean, just because you gave that example, Claude, yeah. But yes.
Yeah, coming back to the, like, I was wondering if the point about, like, sort of relating to, like, pre-colonial ways of knowing, whether we can, like, think about that in terms of, like necessary and sufficient conditions. Like, for example, if what Mitchell was doing when he, like, refers to the Capilla House as, like, it's sort of like, it seems to be a sort of necessary condition almost to sort of to eliminate what the colonial, like the colonial mentioned changes, but it's not like sufficient for properly decolonial that. I think that's a way, like that relationship to these like that's a way of knowing could be created in that terms that someone that seems to be like the possible mistake there, the danger inherent there would then be sort of to take evaluating them as sufficient rather than take evaluating them as sufficient conditions for decolonial returning would be, I guess, the inherent danger.
Sure. I mean, the distinction between necessary and sufficient conditions might be an interesting way of looking at it. But I would really hesitate. Again, I'm not trying to correct your language or trying to sort of control your thought. Well, maybe I am a little bit, but this kind of properly decolonial, this kind of attempt to find a kind of pure state in which you are going to be. Colonialism as a concept, as a historical economic transformation, is a form of material and discursive reality. And the effect of that reality is never pure. No country has ever been fully, perfectly colonized, just like no country would be perfectly decolonized. Now, you can evaluate certain actions in terms of their relationship to structural, and some of them might be necessary but not sufficient. That's a useful way of looking at it. But what would it be sufficient? Like, would it like, are we properly decolonial now? That would be, again, a question mark. But analytically, it's a good distinction if we do not believe that there's going to be this perfect state of being decolonial. That in and of itself is a kind of fantasy of a colonial worldview. Like it will be a perfect society, perfectly decolonized society, perfectly just society, perfectly well-functioning society, etc. And we really want that kind of judgmental purity. And then create kind of fights and arguments and divisions about that. Instead, well, you're not sufficiently colonial. No, I am. You're not. You are actually a corroborator. I mean, we have all of these kind of discourses in the colonized countries. And we always think we are right. I mean, most of the time, nobody thinks like, you are right. Like when you say you're right, you're already saying like, I'm going to join you now because I believe that you're right. I don't know whether that's how you operate, but do you say like, some people might say that, right? Like, I know you're right and I'm wrong, but I'm nevertheless going to believe what I believe. Do you? Do you do that? Well, I mean, nobody would admit it personally, but everybody would attribute to other people too, like, well, others do it, I don't do it. Does anybody say like, yeah, I do that all the time, that makes my life better, easier?
I think to myself, I put structures in there so I can have a semblance of control. So like, this is correct for me because I want to be able to control it.
But do you see that as self-deception?
Yes,
But you still nevertheless continue it.
yes.
So why do you call it deception then?
Because I've been told I have to be in this society in a working way. So I find ways to lie to myself to be able to work inside of it.
You have to?
I like to make myself feel better, yes. So I see that as a have to.
But you might be onto something really interesting, actually. It might be that the necessary condition, maybe not sufficient, but necessary condition of being able to function in the 21st century society is self-deception. That's something to, I mean, I actually think that there's something to that. And the problem with self-deception is that for it to be deceptive, you need to believe it. But if you recognize it as self-deceptive, you cannot believe it, so it cannot deceive you. So it's complicated.
Well, I
Yeah.
was actually thinking about this earlier in terms of time, because I was like, oh, I'm so early, but I like being on time, but why do I like being on time? Why do I believe that time exists and that I have to exist in a form of timeliness? Is what I was thinking, specifically earlier.
In class?
Yeah, when I got here at 12:40.
Yeah. But that's fine.
But it's a self-deception that time is real.
Wow, that's not self-deception, that's just deception.
Okay.
Self-deception is sort of like thinking like, I know I don't want to, I don't like this, or I don't agree with this, but I'm gonna pretend and make myself believe that I agree with it so that I can live.
Okay, yeah.
So, but you can deceive other people, which is probably easier to deceive other people. I mean, I pretend to be a teacher. I pretend to come to class and do all of these things. I can pretend that I like it. I can pretend that I care about what you think, blah, blah. But when I do it to myself, I'm somewhat in this paradoxical position of believing in something that I don't believe, or believing in something that I know it is not true, that I know is not true. Because, you know, when you look at other people, like they believe in what they think. And that's fine. They might be mistaken. That's perfectly okay, but they believe in what they think. But what if you do like, I know this is false, but I'm going to believe it? Like, I know that, you know, I mean, pretty much everything that I mean, I can't even give good examples, but any kind of ideological conviction in the sense that even opposite positions, like the United States is wonderful, the United States is terrible, or the army is great, army is terrible, or like anything, like that kind of ideological self-deception is very interesting. We can actually read something about that. Yes.
And I'm not saying this in kind of like excusing a certain ideological stance, but like, can we even put man at fault for that? Of like framing these oppositions and like going through the process of like self-deception. It's like, I don't know the way I think about it, like I think Nietzsche talked about like nausea and suicide, like when you realize that reality like really means nothing. So of course, someone's gonna have to create some type of coping structure.
Well, sure. Okay, you went all the way existential, which is fine. I would just sort of, I'm talking about more sort of political, economic, ideological self-deception. But you're absolutely right. You know, there is a paradox, like, you know, I don't want to get there too quickly, but like, what difference does it make what you do anyway? We're all gonna die. Could be now. Next time you get on a plane, next time you're on a car. So yes, maybe the greatest self-deception is like, we need to pretend that everything is okay. We need to pretend that everything is normal. Like actually what we are doing here, talking to each other as human beings, confronting each other, is utterly meaningless and crazy. And that's a perspective. Now, I'm not talking that kind of self-deception. I'm talking about really sort of more ideological self-deception, like more in terms of post-colonial, but yeah.
But ideological self-deception can only occur once you
Sure.
have an existential self-deception, so.
Okay, point taken, absolutely, I agree.
And that's not to say that excuses any kind of ideological deception or any harm that is done in circumstances that are taken. I think it's just, you can't even have an order that is not based on some form of self-deception or constructive value. Thus, I don't know how you productively talk about changing the concept of ideological deception, because I don't think that you should go like deception itself is a bad thing, but what are you deceiving yourself to believe?
Sure.
Because the continuation of your existence is dependent on some form of deception.
Sure, yeah, yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I mean, that's what I was trying to say, yes.
Okay,
That's it. Point well taken, yeah.
thank you for that.
I'm not like contesting that at all.
Would self-delusion be,
Excuse me?
would self-delusion be a better way to
self-delusion. Well, I don't want to like suggest too much of negative connotation as saying like there would be a correct way of understanding yourself. So, I mean, the paradox of it, and I don't want to get like too semantic, but even this idea that you can actually have a transparent relationship to yourself is a fantasy. Like I can understand myself. I can know who I am, or even postulate that there is my true self that I can somehow get in touch with, which is a self-deception. And maybe it's necessary for some people strategically in certain points, of course, but I don't want to suggest that there's like opposition between like correct way of understanding yourself as opposed to incorrect. That's why I get away from delusions, and deception is a little more kind of, I don't know, adequate for this? I don't know. Oh, yes. See, they see you, huh?
Hello. Yes. No, I was just going to say, it feels like all of these just keep coming back to the idea of like survival and self-preservation, which might have a little bit more of a positive connotation to it, thinking about Hegel and what he says about identity, like the first and foremost, like kind of reflex of identity is to preserve oneself and to survive alongside other identities. So maybe we do, self-delusion, self-deception, but it all comes back to, at least for me, the way I'm understanding it, it all comes back to preserving oneself. Yes, I don't know if I'm thinking about that in the right way, but.
Yeah, two things about that. One is you should take 19th century if you are interested in this question, because Hegel continues to literally self-deception after master-slave dialectic. It's like Stoicism, beautiful soul, etc. So you are absolutely right. That sort of goes into that issue. But the problem with survival is that this is, to me, a kind of biologically comfortable term. So we say like, we all are trying to survive, which we take it somehow as a premise, right? So you do it in order to survive. Well, but also this is a sort of conscious reconstruction of life. And I think that with probably the debates about like evolution versus creationism and Darwin, etc., this is something that we hold on to. But if you actually study organisms, not just survival, but also self-destruction is equally built into the organisms. So we always think about death as something comes from without, from outside. We somehow think biology as if it's physics, like if you leave something, it will continue to live, and then, but there is something within the organism that is self-consuming, self-destructive, self-expanding, and undermining itself. And you observe this in human behavior more than anything else, in terms of how human beings not just do things for survival, and that comes to the conscious level, the discursive level, etc. But even organisms try to recuperate a situation in which they get the least amount of stimuli in order to be comfortable. And that's the kind of Freudian perspective of the death drive, which continues, but also death is built into the organism itself. So it's not just survival, but it's also extinction. But we don't think that, because we think as human beings, like positively, like, oh, we are trying to survive, we need to survive, etc. No, actually, I'm not even sure that it can be categorically accepted that we are trying to survive. I mean, we think of that rational, we think that of that preferable, we want that at some level, but I don't know whether it's a correct description of organic life. Maybe organic life is also trying to destroy itself. to the extent that you can't even say want or not want. It's just the sort of nature of the process. Every process is not just building and expanding, etc., but it's also contraction and destruction. So therefore, I would be like a little bit careful with the survival, but you're right. It's a relationship to the other in terms of which at least initially you can understand in terms of life-death struggle. Yeah, but then, you know, maybe you actually want to die. Or maybe your organism dies and then you have this conscious thought about not falling into that. But imagine for a second, like how your life would be if you were like, if you survive and everything around you dies. Like, I'm not even sure like my organism can actually tolerate people dying whom I love and I anticipate to live longer than I do. I think it might shut itself out. But I think it will shut itself out. So we are not sure, like whenever we say humankind, human species should survive. And it's like, yeah, but maybe not. Okay, I thought about, did I mention this like after you made your presentation? Like we can communicate with other civilizations in space, did I?
Yeah.
That actually are extinct?
Mhm.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? I think that's pretty like across the 3-dimension, like 4th dimension, like maybe somebody somewhere in the universe sends us a message, and by the time that we receive and decode that message, that civilization would be destroyed already. That's really fascinating. And this is not a fantasy. Apparently, some Harvard physics astronomy professor is doing that, like theorizing about this. So it's not like, and that's good science. Like that's good speculative science rather than. Okay, we are a little bit over time for the first break, so I'm just gonna stop. Blessed.
I just found the scene. And I don't know what that's and I was just like, yeah, like it just that scene was just showing the two sides of the coin in terms of he wants to uphold this European identity and like he's saying what comes to Europe, and then like as a solution, and then it's like he resists that completely, still play into it. Like I don't think I would just Europe. It's like it's water, like it's not Europe.
It's not what?
It's just water.
Yeah.
It's not about where it comes from. Yeah. So yeah, it was just I found it like I just wanted.
Sure. That scene is, yeah, particularly telling. And like the whole symbolics of not being able to perform,
Yeah.
not having power, the kind of emasculation, and that sort of leads into more sort of violent behavior towards her daughter, etc. Towards his daughter, yeah.
I actually read in the book, when V. Du Bois also placed in Senegal. I'm in a class where we're reading Senegalese literature. But a little boy who's working for one of the colonial men in Senegal sees that he's not circumcised. He's like, oh, you're actually a little boy, and you don't know how to care about how the biological plays a part in the truth of colonialism and how we can use it to our advantage or disadvantage when going for or against colonialism.
Yeah. And Al-Haji seems to be taking advantage of colonial structure, and they each get this bag of money.
Yeah, Yeah, that was like the scene, like they leave with they were having like briefcases, and then they inside you see them with these like cameras and money, and it's just like the French people don't even have to say anything. Like they don't say anything, and like they're silent, but still in that they're working, still almost in that silence, which is sort of like this, like it's like this like weird thing, it's like the briefcase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, we are.
I was focusing on like the identity construction of like the church.
Identity.
Yeah, the identity of the people in charge,
Uh-huh.
like the guy in the tuxedos, and how like it's strange because part of them are like all European is better, so they're trying to be as European as possible. But then there's also a part of them that like the president has like a marathon or like a wizard, a witch doctor
Uh-huh.
that he contacts, and I think he said not to tell anyone, or like, oh, because I consider you my friend, so that's why I'm telling you. It's kind of like they are also negotiating their own identity for power.
Yeah.
That's how I read it.
Sure, absolutely, yes. So there's a certain sort of ironic or satirical aspect of the film that you don't exactly make fun of it, but you are pointing out the contradictions of certain positions. Yeah.
It's also interested in both, I thought the kind of symbolism of the fashion that people, like the clothes that people were wearing, and their relationship to colonial structures is really interesting, especially with the wives, the three wives, and their personalities and attitudes towards him, towards Alfonso. And also the fact that he refused to like participate in the marriage traditions of sitting on the pestle or whatever, and then there's like a chicken involved or something. But he went to like the shaman and crawled on his knees with the fetish in his mouth and doing all these like weird things, but he refused to participate in the sort of whatever the traditions of the women were.
Sure.
I was curious why.
Well, I guess the kind of message, like in terms of what we read, what we said at the beginning of the class, so you sort of interpret colonialism as a challenge to your identity. And you somehow protect certain parts of your culture that you wouldn't otherwise protect. And it's almost like this paradoxical aspect. You make it more real, you make it more adhere me to even more to something that I wouldn't adhere otherwise. And that's the kind of defensive identity, like, just because colonizers don't like it, I'm going to stick to it. I mean, I don't like it either, but hey, I'm not going, this is now formed in terms of that opposition. And what he is doing is sort of moving through the history, like, so first his first wife is more sort of older and then traditional, and then as it gets faster, it becomes more modernizer. So by attaching himself to his wives, he's trying to somehow create a relevance for himself. And but then, like, oh, you cannot, sort of criticize traditional cultures because you are the colonizing power. Who are you to tell me that? That somehow actually makes you more stick to some kind of previous identity. It's like I'm sticking with that, or almost reactionarily. And on top of it, nowadays, it is even more insidious. It's like, oh, your culture is actually so cool, so amazing, so wise. So you should go back and be that, like remain who you are rather than change, not because you are incapable, etc., but it is better. So that kind of double message of colonialism always sort of puts you in this paradoxical position in terms of your identity. Yeah.
I also thought it was interesting. I kind of saw the marriage to the third wife, who was also the youngest, and the fact that you never really saw her, only saw her photograph on the wall, and then saw the Mercedes that was supposed to be like the wedding gift, and she never got off of the tow truck thing that it was on.
Huh.
I wonder who's. I kind of saw it as a reference to like maybe a sort of material
Sure.
being married to the economic status or whatever.
Well, I mean,
Actual person.
yeah, that, yes. But marriage, like, you know, those of you who are anthropologists would know better than I, marriage has always been that kind of economic agreement rather than, like, it's only very recent that it's about love, ostensibly. So, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I kind of thought of like when El Haji was kind of kicked out of the cabinet, he said like everybody is like dirty dog.
Uh-huh.
I mean, after his daughter told him like the polygamous man is dirty dog too.
Uh-huh.
And like when we prepare for the protocol, we're talking about it as like when you're no longer part of the system, you can't be able to criticize it.
Like at the end, he's like, we are all dirty dogs. And that's when his daughter calls him. Yeah, in the movie, no way.
Uh-huh. Because he's trying to get power within that system.
Well,
Yeah.
and he's like just been thrown out. He's no longer.
Oh, from the commerce thing?
Chamber of Commerce.
Chamber of Commerce, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that more like during the speech and it's like, yeah, but like it's like I was getting the impression that this is like there's the colonial structure and everything, and like these guys have inherited it and continued debt,
Uh-huh.
and then now it's become he's like essentializing the fact that they're doing jobs, like it's, you know, it gave like it seemed as if he started to believe it was within nature or whatever to like be this person, and like that there was no way that he could have been in this position and not have done the things that he did, like in terms of like, corruption. Like he took it upon himself. Like this is just how this is who I am now. That's
Sure, but I think what the movie does is, first of all, you need the positions to be occupied by people from there, but you don't want them to operate selfishly in terms of their own power, but he does. Like he does, and that's the kind of the paradox. You are supposed to be a symbol of power, but you really should not be powerful. And that's why when he is sort of having problems with competence, he compensates that with the public trust. So it's all about empowering certain people, and empowering certain people is always a paradoxical premise. Yes, Mohammed Ali. Sorry, you are a little late over there. I don't see your hand from the two other hands behind you, so confusing.
I just found as a meta thing, the translation and subtitles were really interesting. They're very incomplete, and specifically, there was a lot of use of like Alhamdulillah or Salam Alaikum by characters, and that was never translated. That was never put in the subtitles. So I feel like in that process, like it sort of erases this sort of like Islamic background radiation of the setting, and then you also miss that sort of extra level of when and which characters are speaking Wolof versus French. And so I just think the politics of what gets lost in translation there. Interesting.
Yeah, that might be partially ideological, partially technical, because this one was from YouTube, the one I sent you. I watch it in the actual DVD, so it's or like when you translate it on YouTube, it might be different. I'm not really sure. I haven't seen that version, so I can't really say.
It's not the YouTube translation, but the subtitles were baked in. Whatever they pulled the YouTube video from, the subtitles are from that. So I'd
Okay,
assume
okay, yeah, that might very well be. But I mean, I hear Salam Alaikum, so I probably didn't even pay attention to it. So yeah, but that's a good point. Of course. Yeah. Yes.
The other thing that I found really interesting was the fact that he never said a word, like and he was just there, and like at the end when they asked him, it's kind of seemed like he was just there, but then I felt like it was like represented the influence of the colonizers, like in terms of like in their meetings still. Like he was just making sure that everything was still going according to how.
Oh, the French guy, you mean, who gave them the, yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of like he was just trying to make sure that everything was going according to that. Like he was just there to oversee what's happening. And then if anything was going according to plan, you would then have stepped in, but then so yeah, I found that like really interesting.
Of course, I think that's Sambana's intention too. Like that's what he wants to, like, this is the continuation of the colonial structure, and that is more muted is actually more relevant. Yeah, and it becomes even more effective because you don't really have the sort of reactionary or the rebellious discourse anymore. Yeah, that's true. You don't want to be seen by people that you exercise power over. But I want to say something a little bit more controversial now in terms of what Mohammed Ali said and the kind of discourses that colonialism produces. Now, okay, this is politically a little bit problematic, so I'm not recording this part. Actually, I don't think that's too controversial. So, what do you think? I'm looking at you now. You don't see me because I need to look at here to see you. The camera is not in my computer anymore, so yeah. Thoughts, ideas, questions? Any other points about the movie?
Response to that it's what he just, I mean, what he said sort of sounds like the Mohammed piece.
The what?
Is that how you say that? You say your last name? Mohanty. And
Oh, Chandra Mohanty. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. You have to warn me that you switched to the readings
yeah,
now.
exactly.
Okay, yeah.
But what he said sounds like, I think, what part of what she was expressing there, that this like way of, sort of like ostensibly like liberal, permissive-ish approach that like at the same time says like makes assertions as if there is like one coherent Islam, like oh like
Exactly.
this is this and like oh it's like, and so even in that move, even when it's like a move from like sometimes probably like not like a little bit problematic critiques to like the shift to like sort of valorization, they still sort of do similar things in terms of like what kind of like universalizations they're making, which I think was what also he was getting at.
Sure. I think I agree that there is the kind of like third world women or sort of third world and some kind of a categories that ultimately have this effect of solidifying and petrifying what you are ostensibly describing. And you're right, and Islamophobia, there is that assumption is that any kind of response is Islamophobic. It becomes sort of overarching sort of complaint and accusation, and it really doesn't recognize the sort of incredible complexity of any religion, especially Islam, which some parts of it could be phobic, could be scary. So that doesn't really mean the same thing in every context. Well, of course, what people have in mind is that all these like crazy people who are burning, Quran and then, making fun of Muhammad, etc., then you are accusing them of Islamophobia. Then that totalizing discourse becomes like whatever you say, you are associated with those crazy people who are doing this, which is really makes the discourse very simplistic and very sort of accusatory. I'm more morally superior to you than you, so I'm superior to you morally. That's what it aims, rather than to have a kind of informed discussion about anything. So yeah, that's true. I like, third world women. We should let third world women talk. It's like, what does that even mean? Like, who are you talking about? Like, what is that conception that you have in mind? And I think that every concept, especially if it is politically deployed, can have that really opposite and stupefying impact. And that might be true of everything, actually. So just in general. I mean, not everything, but every concept. So yes, okay. So I guess we are moving to Lorde and Chandra Mohanty slowly, unless you have other observations about Hala. Were you like, watch it till the end? Was it a little bit of pudding at the end? I thought that was very symbolic, like people spitting on you. What's that?
The noises at the end. I don't know if they amplify just the sounds of them spitting, but
And
that
then
got me more than the actual ones.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, like the first time I watched it, it didn't bother me. And then the second and third time bothered me even more. I don't know why. It's sort of like, I don't know why this, but I mean, maybe it's more effective. I always watch it a couple of times before I can even like wrap my mind around. So. No? Okay, well, let's take another break because this is a kind of natural spot to stop, and then we'll move to the readings for today. Oh, unless you have any questions about the top paper for Wednesday, so just think about that, and then we'll start with that on at 10 minutes, perfect, at 3. Okay. A thematic connection between these two texts in terms of the argument. One is really short, and it's really one fundamental thought that needs to be articulated. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, which became a kind of saying almost in terms of the conceptual point that she's making. And of course, what it does is kind of this very complex phenomenon of creating unities, the necessity of creating unities for political strategy at the expense of denying differences. And that's really, what's that?
That's what the first essay is about?
Oh, I don't know. Yes?
Yeah. Okay, because I have a lot of questions.
Okay, so the problem was, as women, we have been taught either to ignore our differences or to view them as causes for separation and suspicion rather than as forces for change. So the conceptual problem that she is indicating there is, for political unities, you need to forget the differences and come together. And what inevitably happens is that as a result of these political strategies is there are certain differences that are ignored and certain aspects of that group, of that unity that is ignored, and it is always constructed on the basis of certain specific characteristics of a certain specific group within that group. So this is the kind of insight that what the masters does is to somehow eradicate differences. So you cannot really undermine a power structure by eradicating differences and assuming a kind of unity that is not there. You need to resist that. And that's, of course, conceptually very sound, but politically very difficult, because the problem is we cannot get together enough people to do something, right? So we try to convince other people, forget about whatever you are thinking, just come down, do this, type of thing. So what are your questions?
Well, my question was, it seems like the problem that she's explaining is the fact that we create categories, right? And we place people, no matter who they actually are, we kind of disregard their differences and place them in these categories. You're a feminist, or you're a white feminist, or you're a black feminist, or you're a black lesbian feminist, or you're, you kind of create all these, categories. But if that's the issue, then why does she place herself within a category? Like she calls herself she says as a black lesbian feminist, blah, 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 which is a category, and there are other black lesbian feminists who are not like her, who are different from her, I guess it seemed like her argument was kind of superficial.
Well, it's 4 pages.
Yeah,
I mean,
it is 4 pages.
you can expect like deep sort of criticism in this. It's sort of like a speech within a conference. She's not probably engaged in a sort of profound critique, but she's indicating the difficulty of that. Now, you're absolutely right. Like, there is a certain identification with certain categories in her discourse. So I stand here as a black lesbian feminist, having been invited to comment within the only panel at this conference where the input of black feminists and lesbians are represented. Now, you can read it in 2 ways. You can read it as this is what Audre Lorde is somehow accepted. This is me. Like whenever, like as a blah blah, like you are sort of putting out that on the table of who you are in terms of identity, which might be what you actually believe in these categories, but you might also be performing a certain expectation that I am invited here to represent certain categories, and that might be the problem. Now, of course, we cannot know that because she doesn't explain that explicitly. To read this program is to assume that lesbian and black women have nothing to say of existentialism, the erotic, women's culture and silence, developing feminist theory, or heterosexuality and power. And what does it mean in personal political terms, even when the 2 black women who did present here literally found at the last minute. So what happens is that I am called here in terms of this identity category. So therefore, my very presence and my announcement of that might be the very criticism of this conference. So I read it that way, to be more sort of productive. I mean, I'm not sure what she herself did, but like, so, oh, you want me to speak as a black feminist woman because you need that representation. I'm not necessarily identifying with that, but I'm sort of articulating how you identify me, and I'm responding to that. That might be,
Would you call it like empty representation?
What's that again?
Empty representation?
It's not so much anti-representation as the kind of criticizing the representational structure that is associated with the center of power. like, for example, you can say like, oh, I'm here at Earlham College to give you a little bit of diversity and color because that's what you need. That's my function here. You are a white dominated discourse and you want me to give you legitimacy, or not even legitimacy, but like window dressing, like sort of some kind of vision to like, you know, we include these people among us too type of legitimacy. So that might be this is not a genuine engagement with me as a person, as a writer, as a woman, but Black feminist woman that you kind of categorically put on display. And, you know, this was Nolia's critique of this class, for example, if you sort of tokenism, like, you know, oh, I need to have some, you know, people who represent different viewpoints so that I appear to be more complete. Or as if that's going to really solve the problem of colonialism in this case, for example, is it representational? And we saw that even in the film, like it doesn't really mean much if the representation of power in the Chamber of Commerce is French or not, or Senegalese, it's the same function. So that's how I read it. Okay, so I'm not sure. She would, I mean, even within those categories, you can start thinking about the problems, like the the enumeration and the proliferation of categories doesn't exactly specifically identify you as a person, but in fact takes you further away from your relationship to yourself. Because it creates this tension now, like sort of, and then even within that category, and I keep saying that that's why we come across these problems, like when you say a feminism, when you're saying feminism, you are talking about a contradictory concept because you want to be a feminist in a certain way, and you want to be a feminist not in a certain way. Nobody today wants to be a white feminist, but they want to be a feminist, which means I want to be a specific type of feminist, not that kind of feminist. And if you are that kind of feminist, I'm not with you. Well, are we both feminists? Well, I'm the real feminist, actually. That's the implication. But this is always how we kind of negotiate categories. We say, like, I am a Muslim, but I'm not that kind of Muslim. I'm a Christian, but I'm not hating blah, blah, because Christianity is not about hate, etc. So they're always trying to negotiate these categories in terms of contradictions and differences, even though we might believe it's the same category. And there is that contradiction in the sameness. Yes, it is the same category, but it is a contradictory category. That doesn't mean you should dismiss it just because it's contradictory, but you need to negotiate that contradiction.
I have a quick question about one of her sentences. It's on page 27. She says, divide and conquer in our world must become define and empower. And I was just wanting to clarify what she means by define there. Does she mean like redefining the connotation of difference so that feminism can be eventually redefined? I was just a little...
What paragraph is that? I can't find that just specifically.
The last sentence of that, I think, a little.
Oh, okay. In the world of possibility of us, our personal visions help lay the groundwork for political action. The failure of the academic feminists to recognize difference as a crucial strength is a failure to reach beyond the first patriarchal lesson. What's the first patriarchal lesson? Divide and conquer in our world must become define and empower. So what the patriarchy does is divide and conquer. I guess that's what patriarchy does, according to her. Now it must become define and empower what you define, which I don't know whether that's the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, and the opposite of master's tools will never dismantle the master's house either. Maybe. Whatever the opposite of the tools of masters are, or like just doing the opposite of what master did. So that might be a criticism.
My biggest issue with this particular essay, and I understand that it's only 3 pages and it's a speech, is that she says a lot of things that seem like they have like some cool ideas behind them, and then just keeps on moving on without actually going into any of them. And I don't know, it feels, I don't know, I am just left, at the end of it, I was like, wait, what? Like, what do you mean by all of these things? You say these things, and there's no really like you don't back them up with
Sure.
anything, you don't break them down logically.
Well, that's why it's put as the first essay of this. So we are not really reading this as a kind of, as you said, backing up certain ideas and arguments, but somehow posing certain questions that we will develop, like we'll interpret and develop. So because that, Uyan was asking this question in the previous session for the master's tool that's on page 27 at the top. We'll never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, because Uyan said that game precisely, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. So that, to me, that genuine change, of course, it's vague and not, genuine change sometimes is not genuine change, and who decides how genuine it is, etc. But there's always that question of how do we relate to patriarchy, for example. So like, like how is feminism serving patriarchy type of thing.
I also had a question, I think it was on page 26. She said something about active and passive being.
Active and passive.
Yeah.
Interdependency between women is the only way to the freedom, which allows the I and be not in order to be used, but in order to be creative. This is a difference between the passive be and the active being.
Yeah, I wasn't sure what she meant by that.
Well, again, I'm speculating because she doesn't develop this, but I am this and you are that. And that's the category. And in this case, it's like you are free as a woman, I am free as a woman, etc. But if our freedom is the result of our acting together in a kind of creative togetherness, then this is an active way of being, not as a property of having it. So when I say passive be free, like you have freedom as a property or as a power, etc., as opposed to actually living it out in your actions and being free. So that's how I read it. And it's a good, again, a very sort of short and sketchy way of problematizing this idea of like when you are saying like, I am a feminist is a very, men say that too today, but like a lot of people say like, I'm a feminist, but I'm not being feminist. Like I can say, I'm a feminist, please identify me as such and recognize me as such, but I'm not going to do anything. It's just a property that I have that I use for social capital. But when it comes to doing something, I'm not going to do anything. Like, I'm a very helpful person, but I'm not going to help anybody. When it comes to helping doing things, you won't do it. So like, like Earlham being really interested in diversity. But when it comes to actually hiring people, I'm not going to do that. Are you raising your hand?
Yeah.
Yes, I can see it. Like you are doing it while you are doing on Zoom. Okay.
I just think that a possibility with like the length of this and how she does it. On the bottom of page 27, she talks about how like this idea that it's the task of Black and third world women to educate White women and like all of that. And I feel like there's just this general energy throughout that she's not going to take on the entire load of like developing this new way of being and like creating it all, but this is just
Huh.
one statement to start. It's not like, oh, this is my job.
Hmm.
I don't know, so that just
Well, to the extent that she's an educator and participates in a conference, of course, that's a task. I think what she's referring to is to kind of this resistance, like, resistance to being educated, like not accepting what she says. Not that I'm sure anybody would be very thrilled if people here are excited and agree with what they say. I think that education is sort of like this, how we see education. Like, I'm going to educate you, damn it. Like we always look at education today as a kind of power. It's like slapping somebody or burning somebody, like, I educated you. Like like, you know what I mean? That kind of notion of education to which you are resisting. And I'm imposing it upon you because I destroyed your argument. I proved how wrong you are. I educated you. I think that kind of definition is, of course, what makes you exhausted because you are constantly resisting me. Like you are resisting to be educated. It's like as if that's something I do to you, right? Yeah. But you're right. I mean, in terms of, but also like, it is again a 4-page, I mean, she wrote longer things, so it's not like, yeah. Yes.
I forgot what I was going to say, but
Okay. That's good sometimes. So define and empower, like that is also a desire for us to be able to think about power. We think of power a little bit also as a kind of capital. We think of it as a kind of zero-sum game. We think of it like if I have power, you don't. And it's always like we need to take power from some person and give it to another person. We really don't think of power as mutually proliferating each other. So we always think of it as restricting, like if somebody has power, the other person is restricted. And I think that's the issue of, and it is true to a certain extent when you are in a, I don't know, like I imagine in a sort of any kind of group meeting, certain people are going to dominate and speak more and, silence other people, and they'll do what they need to do. And that's the kind of power that is exercised. But we really don't reconceptualize, and that's what she's suggesting. Like my ability to do something doesn't diminish your ability to do certain things. In fact, your ability to do certain things augments my ability to do things. And we really don't have that kind of conception under capitalist mode of production, in which it's the accumulation of wealth that takes the form of material possessions. And we look at power as material possession too. Yeah, so. Yes.
yeah, like also I think also with the thing about like categories and the way she deploys them here, I think part of the implication that I think you're getting at is that it's like insofar as like this category can just appear from nowhere, like they've already like been like completely historically determined. And so like I think what she sees as like the white feminist movement or whatever pretend as if those historical determinations did not already happen. And like I think it's sort of, and so almost the way I think Kurosawa's deploying categories is sort of in that, in view of those like very concrete historical determinations rather than like a historical position of like, oh, no more categories, but it's like these categories have like been historically determined, not question that I think she's raising, and then we have to think it's like, okay, what do you do with them? And that I think was just the text have like this discourse of creativity, which I found like pretty interesting. Not quite sure what to do with it, but there's like this thing of like a creative, like difference as a creative function. And like I think about that also in terms of the way Mitchell uses reality effect. And this kind of like, so like a functional deployment of things. And so there's that whole discourse happening here, which yeah, I don't really know what to do with, but it's like a question, I guess, to think of.
Okay, that's a really great observation. That sort of makes me think like, yes, that might be the effect of a text, reading it speculatively, in the sense that, okay, this essay was what, 1983? Like today, in every respectable discussion of feminism, there is the recognition that feminism was actually dominated by white women, and therefore it is problematic. I don't think that anybody would deny that now. Nobody would say, oh no, there was not such a problem, right? But this is 1983. So like 17 plus 21, 38 years ago. So what we take for granted today is something, maybe it was equally clear at the time, but it needed to be said because there was a white dominated feminist discourse. And it was operating with a so-called universal conception of woman. And that needed to be challenged. And this is an essay that at the time challenges a form of discursive orthodoxy, but today something that we take for granted. Now, that you can see it as in terms of the history of ideas, and you can say, oh, this is an interesting, important, significant essay, even though in terms of its impact, we don't look at it as insignificant anymore because it had a really great impact, or at least part of that impact. So we take it for granted now. And it's like, oh, we already know that. Like, why are you even saying that? Well, you already know that because this was said at the time. So then you can read it as a kind of historical respect, etc. But you can also read it as, what are the orthodoxies today that she challenges in terms of feminism that we can deploy today? So that kind of approach of looking at it as a speculation of not some issue in the past, that, like, whatever, but it still happens, of course. I mean, there's still a kind of very powerful white feminist discourse, but also how that can be thought about differently today. So that's the speculative reading of it, not in terms of it, of, okay, it accomplished everything and it's finished, or it didn't accomplish anything, etc. But how does it help us to think today? Not because she's right or wrong. I mean, unfortunately, she's no longer with us, so probably doesn't care whether she's right or wrong, but in terms of our thinking of how we relate to that. So yeah. Like I was like, yeah, 1983, like that's a long time ago. I mean, not that long, but still, in terms of intellectual history. So we are reading it as, that's the problem of like how we approach certain things. It's like, oh, I mean, you would call this almost a passé essay now. Like that, of course we know this. Come on, tell us something new. But that's really kind of a blind way of reading history and its relationship to the present, because this is created, these ideas that we have and take to be true and orthodox today are really created by certain people. They are not just sort of self-evident ideas that we take for granted, because there was a conception And there's still a conception of a universal conception of what it means to be a woman. Because you needed that for solidarity, for unity, for undermining patriarchy. It so happens it was defined by a certain type of women at a certain historical period, but still, there's still like, oh, there must be something in common to all of us. And we still use it, and we still have that sort of universal connotations when we use it. We don't look at it as a paradoxical, contradictory concept. Just like Western women, part of it, they were not just white. I mean, of course, it goes together, but Western women, and this is the categorization of third world women, and a parallel argument in Chandra Talpare Mohanty's essay, how you are actually, by describing third world women, you are actually describing first world women. So by describing your opposite, or like under the tutelage of man, oppressed, only have prostitution as an alternative, blah, 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 you are actually constructing your identity as liberated, emancipated, powerful, enlightened. However sophisticated or problematic its use as an explanatory construct. This is really cool. This is on page 49 of Mohanty's essay. However sophisticated or problematic its use as an explanatory construct, colonization almost invariably implies a relation of structural domination and a discursive or political suppression of the heterogeneity of the subjects in question. Well, yes and no. For the most part, sure. I think that, but have whatever sophisticated and problematic, that's a kind of a, I don't know. So what do you think of this? What do you think?
Just this one statement.
Just this one statement. Well, of course, in the context of her entire essay, but just this sentence, like, however sophisticated and problematic its use as an explanatory construct, colonization, almost invariably. So I need to be careful. I shouldn't say invariably, almost invariably, because I need to leave the possibility open that it might be something else, implies a relation of structural domination and a discursive or political suppression. Oh, well, I mean, those are two separate issues. It's not just can be connected with, or of the heterogeneity of the subjects in question. Now, it's a complicated sentence because she might be assuming that those subjects in questions are already there, that are already constructed independently of the explanatory construct that we call colonialization. So, but she articulates that because the idea of third world woman would never emerge except, or third world woman as an identity category would never emerge except in the discourse of feminism because of woman, and in the context of colonialism because of the third world. So there is no such thing as a third world woman as a naturally occurring human species or something like that. It is always discursively constructed in its suppression, actually, not in its sort of non-suppression. So the idea is that you start seeing yourself as a third world woman precisely because you are created by patriarchy and the colonization as that. So this is the kind of Derridian structure of deconstruction that we need to be careful, namely whatever you attribute an authenticity to the other is always created in the discursive practices of the same, of the hierarchically powerful binary opposition. But it is so tempting too. I mean, isn't it? Like to be that which was created by the power discourse as the other. There's a certain desire and pleasure, almost discursive pleasure, not physical pleasure necessarily. Discursive pleasure in assuming that role. And it also creates that pleasure. I mean, unfortunately, colonization creates that pleasure. I'm not so sure patriarchy does, but that's another discussion. So, what's the problem? The problem is reducing third world women to a monolithic concept. Like, what are we talking about? Like, billions and billions of people, at least a couple of billion people, to one category. And assuming that you can make statements, representations, identifications that are applicable, despite the fact that you might specify the conditions as narrowly as possible. I'm only talking, this is like what I love about like anthropologists, especially. Like I'm really talking about this really tiny fraction of a group in this area, in this village, in this century, and then make these gigantic generalizations of categories on the basis of that. That gives me empirical certainty because I'm a master of that. I know what I'm talking about. And precisely from that, I can make these categorical inferences as much as possible until I'm called on that. Then I'll say, oh, I'm not doing that. I love academics and that little impossible to catch position. Oh, no, I'm not doing that. Yes.
I think my question with this is that she's saying intelligation. Well, I think she's saying humanization isn't bad, but it's more that it needs to be more specific and it needs to be intertwined with like other system. It cannot just be gender alone. It has to be gender mixed with class, mixed with the country's religion and ideology.
Sure.
And yeah, I guess I was wondering if that's the right way to read her. And also, if that is the case, then how do we measure that? Like, because it's still generalization. It needs to be specific, but how specific do we need to be to fight against?
Okay, I think that, all right. So the generality and the effectiveness of colonization, if it were a purely discursive power, then you could perhaps resist it by discursive specificity. I think material systems are much more difficult in their generality because of the repetition that is at work, not just universal or general applicability. So whenever you are talking about two people from two different parts of the world seeing similarities in their oppression, seeing similarities in their discourses that somehow push them into being the second-class citizen, right? That doesn't mean they are operating within the same material conditions And that doesn't mean that their response to it could be or should be the same. This is the sort of deceptive aspect of colonialism. Like, you know, if I watch Sambene and I kind of look at Senegal and I feel like that's Turkey. That's exactly how certain people in Turkey behave. From that kind of similarity and structural similarity, I don't make the assumption whatever happens in Turkey should be reproduced and applied to Senegal or vice versa. I think that's the difficulty of confusing discursive regularity and repetition and similarity with material conditions. And that's what I want to be careful about, saying that we don't stay at the level of discursive, because we agree, you and I or whoever can agree, except when what that means in material conditions might be completely different. In fact, I might actually turn totally against you, even though we can be discursively and conceptually agree. Yes.
I was gonna say, this isn't so much of a substantial comment, but Solomon Mahmoud's Politics of Piety is like a great example.
So what again?
Solomon Mahmoud's Politics of Piety is a great example.
Politics of piety.
Explaining the way in which we can address colonization with their different cultural standards for what women want to be. And it talks about liberation in a very non-Western type of way. It gets into like a really big theoretical grasp. It's an absolute useful text.
Politics of piety.
Yeah, politics.
Okay.
It specifically is focused around the women's piety movement in Cairo, Egypt. It's an ethnographic study. Beautiful detail. The kind of milk makes your brain feel like it smells a little bit, but
Who is this again?
Sabra Mahmoud.
Okay. Thanks for the suggestion. Okay.
I just like comment on like, and that's like the whole thing like about like Black feminism specifically, of like understanding that feminism and like women don't experience things the same way in any kind, and like intersectionality is a thing, and that like, yes, while feminism could be understood as a like the oppression of like the female body, but also like there's more to it, because like during like through feminism, like we're able to like also like see the LGBTQ like rights and like different like intersectionalities that sometimes like through like white feminism like have not been seen. And like I think that's like why in the like the author in the first one like talks about the being, because like a lot of people call themselves like feminists, but then like also may like have a race, like can be racist. So like there's like things like you have to understand, like feminism is it like goes beyond just like advocating for women's rights. Like feminism is also about advocating for like racism and like classism and like a lot of other things that come with it. And
Right.
yeah, it's like I don't know if I'm getting it right, but like what you were saying of like this not being like a monolith of like everyone goes through the same like problems. No, like yes, we go through oppression, but like we also are oppressed in different ways.
No, what I'm asking you is like, why do you assume feminists should be non-racist?
Should not what? Sorry?
What made you say that a feminist should not be racist?
Like, why shouldn't?
Yeah.
Well, in my opinion, like, I don't know, like it goes to a very personal aspect, in my opinion, like
Questioning, no, I'm sorry. I'm not questioning that, no, it should be racist or anything like that. What made you think that it is within the definition and concept of feminism that somehow need to resist racism? That's my question. I'm not saying that you should be racist or anything like that. It's just that what is in feminism that you see as an essential property of feminism that, and I'm asking this not to you to put you on the spot, but as a question of what do we expect these categories to do? Like how can we expect a certain kind of non-racist attitude from feminism, and why? Because what are we doing with concepts here? What do we expect the concept to operate as once we do that? A kind of inoculation against any kind of oppressive structure because you, as a feminist, you think that you are speaking in the name of an oppressed group. That was my question. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No. I don't know if I'm getting the question, but like I think it goes back again to like subjectivity and like how people like some are like how to even to a point Black women weren't considered like even like human or like even women. Like I feel that also like stems a lot from like racism and like how Black women have had to like create their own way of feminism because they were not included in that like so-called Western feminism that was advocating for women, but actually was like for certain women. So it was actually like it was conditional. It was not like we're all women, so I'm advocating for every woman. No, it was like conditional. If you were white and you were privileged in a lot of ways, like you were able to participate and like fulfill, like be able to like act upon your feminism, while like in a lot of ways, Black feminists have been like policed, and like that's how I got it. I don't know if that's like what we're relating it to, class. So I'm sorry if I'm like getting off topic.
That is absolutely what we are relating to the class, and you are absolutely right to raise this question. And I think it's even the observation is absolutely right on. My question is taking that and sort of trying to think along with you in terms of like, what is it in a concept like feminism or a kind of movement or a kind of, I don't want to say ideology, but a kind of belief system that which would allow us to identify as non-racist, or what would make me think that a proper feminist should be non-racist? What is in feminism that somehow would inoculate you or protect you from being racist? My suspicion is that there isn't anything other than what you put into it, because that category doesn't give you that, certainly because it's a completely different set of relationships in which you may or may not be educated about anything. But my suspicion is that we do that ideologically because we are speaking in the 21st century Western culture like the United States, in which we need to not just address this or that oppression like these other cultures do in their own pathetic ways, but we want to address all of them. We want to create the absolute, pure, wonderful, non-oppressive system, as opposed to other cultures which are non-racist, but patriarchal, but blah, blah. So our conception of ourselves as a subject is free from all sorts of possible injustice. I call injustice, you said domination or repression, etc. So that's my question. And again, you are absolutely right. Feminism has been that way, and it was obviously wrong. So you universalized from your own experience as a white woman and thought that everybody, and you didn't see it from the perspective of Black women, etc. Those are all true, except why would you expect anything else? And then if you look at the way in which these are historically constituted as actually feminist discourse, like go look at the way in which universal suffrage in the United States has been articulated for women. It's not just casually kind of by mistake racist, but it is racist in a very specific way. Because sometimes in order to achieve certain things, you have to throw other people under the bus. It's always what the colonial structure does. It always plays different people against each other.
I guess though, like, so, I guess, but then on the one hand, what, because if, I guess you're claiming like this, I guess like there's nothing within feminism that like necessitates that, like, so I think the other thing, I guess, be kind of true, but then I wonder, like, if that is the case, how is it that people were able to sort of recognize that there's like say the universal suffrage movement, for example, the universal suffrage movement in the States, for example. But if like, how I guess how is it that people weren't able to recognize that there's something sort of like wrong with this feminism if they cannot, if like
I don't think that, what do you mean there's something wrong?
like because of the way that like that project was carried out, like if one cannot like recognize that, yeah, like challenges to that, how, and then I wonder like on what does they have, they challenges come from a certain ground, so like I'm wondering like if it's actually the case that there's nothing that necessitates that, on what ground would such challenges be made?
On the ground that it is racist, not on the ground that it is not feminist.
It doesn't, yes, but then but that still somehow serves as a challenge to that feminism, I think is why.
Sure, a racist, anti-racist challenge, not a feminist challenge. So I'm asking you, what is in the nature of feminism, if anything, that makes that challenge internally? Because if there were something like that, that would not even have happened. Then they would say like, oh, well, wait a second. Like, because you are identifying with a category, you are identifying with a concept, and that's woman, not an anti-racist woman. That's the problem. Now, I'm not saying that you cannot be, you should not have been, etc. But discursively, that is not a feminist challenge as much as an anti-racist challenge. I'm not accusing them of being less feminist than, I mean, who am I to say that? Yeah, I'm glad we are here. I think maybe we should read that essay of Karen Shaw on intersectionality. What do you think? Because first of all, it is a very misunderstood concept, and it's even worse than colonialism, I think, in terms of the way in which we throw around the term of intersectionality. And that, yeah, that might be a good idea.
Because yeah, I'm just sort of like, yeah, there's like the colloquial like use of it, and like that it's been, but then the other hand, one thing also, like going back to the thing I want to really want to say, and sort of like, so if that challenge is saying that challenge is sort of like the challenge is an anti-racist challenge, but not like but not necessarily a feminist challenge, but it could also be like could also be because I think it could also be an anti-racist challenge that upon being issued also sort of becomes a feminist challenge, if that makes sense.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure, I mean, it better be, yes. But that's a different discourse. That's a different kind of concept that we are deploying here. And on the basis of that, but I mean, then the correctness of it, I mean, some people might today say, well, I don't care about anti-racism or feminism, I'm for women. That's my fundamental and primary and most important point of contention. And we experience that today in the discourses of between feminism and trans movement. And there are certain feminists who are still very adamant in their understanding of women as a universal biological category. Yes, Anna.
I'm just wondering if it's worth thinking about it as like if the commonality between like anti-racism and feminism is the celebration of difference, if that's like the ultimate goal, like the link between the two discourses could be like preparatory. So like if you master like the discourse of feminism, there's something in that discourse that communicates with you like we need to celebrate difference. That's the link between the two. So it's not so much that they equate with one another, but that they prepare you to be more well versed in the other, kind of.
Sure. I mean, that's the political and to me a little bit ideological thinking behind this. But the question is, what does it mean to be celebrating difference? Because if you are, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, when I hear that question, I just think of the main argument in the really long essay. I forgot the title of it, but her argument is that woman as category is wrong because there are kind of subcategories. I don't know. Does that make sense? Okay. Like,
I mean, it's not wrong. It is just that placed into this paradox, you need to use it. You cannot use it. You must use it, but you can never use it just as if it has a proper identity and that you understand that proper identity, right? So this is really my problem. And I think we should read the intersectionality because conceptually, here's my problem. On the one hand, in order to create any kind of commonality between anti-racism and feminism or any, I mean, feminism is a little bit problematic nowadays, but anyway, any kind of discourse in terms of celebrating differences, then you have this possibility of doing that only to the extent that you oppose both of it to a center that you have to keep intact in order to gain the coherence of your own discourse. This is the paradox that we actually preserve the integrity of the center of the power in order to preserve the integrity of our discourses as respecting difference. That's my conceptual problem. Does that make sense? So then this designation of white Christian European male becomes a kind of constructed center that needs to be there so that I can create a solidarity between different groups that respect identity. Yet, more and more, when that respecting identity discourse is appropriated by more and more white Christian European discourse, then we are somehow in this paradoxical situation because from the perspective of power, you are the one who has the most potential to bring diversity to the world. Therefore, the powerful institution of Western European culture still boasts the most diverse sort of elements by incorporating purchasing really people and institutions to make themselves appear in a certain way. So we are still embroiled in that paradox of what does it mean to respect difference, right? If you have the power to tolerate the other in your midst without that other undermining your identity. So if you have a fragile identity in terms of which you are trying to create a commonality, you really don't have the same power and resources to respect identity. Because your identity is under threat.
Is it possible then to even have one like universal feminist discourse?
I hope not.
Yeah,
I hope not. I mean, well,
I don't know. We
It
just
can-
keep referring to it as the feminist discourse, and so I don't know. That just like
No,
the
it's-
singular, like it's
Okay.
a plurality. I don't know.
great. That's what I do to you all the time. I'm so glad you are doing it to me now. Like, yes, it is. Whenever we talk about these concepts, you need to be always careful that it should not be sort of proposed as if these are actually valid and definable category. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes.
I'm gonna be kind of selfish in this. I was wondering if we could talk about gender as a social construct later on, if that was created for colonialism and its effects now. Are there any papers for
Ooh.
that?
In terms of colonialism, we can start. I mean, I can only start with Judith Butler, but we can, if you have any suggestion.
I don't have a suggestion. I just saw a video. It's like we should decolonize gender. I don't even know how to do that. This is me being
Okay,
selfish and asking you.
Sure. We can talk about that definitely. And I'm not sure what, I mean, I'm always sort of hesitant where to enter these discourses because there's a history, there is the sort of elements that establish the conceptual framework first, and then the most recent and interesting ones. There's always that kind of tension. But I obviously would go immediately to Judith Butler to talk about that performativity and the gender construction. But there are probably more interesting things in terms of decolonization now. I need to look into that. But maybe we should look into that intersectionality. And I like the fact that the rest of the class is sort of opening up to multiple possibilities rather than continuing with this. But like, we'll talk about this more on Wednesday, the Western scholarship and colonial discourses. Well, I'll let you know. Well, you're writing your papers for Wednesday, right? Okay, so don't read anything unless you want to, and you want to bring to class, but I guess you'll be working on your papers. So are there any questions that you need to ask in the last few minutes about the papers? How is it going? You haven't started, have you? Who has started with the paper? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, I like this. Like, this is my hand, but it really isn't. Like, yeah, it is there, but it is not. So, okay. Any questions? Any problems? Any difficulties?